Dr. Mohandas Pai, Dr. Balal, Dr. Nam Ryan, Ambassador Neelam, my friend MD Nalapat, distinguished visitors, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. Today the world is at an inflection point, seeing tremendous change as happened when the idea of colonization took shape in the early 19th century. It is not very often that you see a change of such magnitude around the world. When we saw the decline of Asia, the rise of Europe, the rise of imperialism, the rise of nationalism in the previous century, it led to two great wars. But it led to the decline of Asia in a very significant manner. Right from the time history was recorded, Asia was the largest economic power on this planet, led by India and China. It's only in the 18th and 19th century, with the rise of trade from Europe, the formation of the East India Company, and the United Kingdom taking over many parts of Asia, that we saw the rise of Europe and a change in the global dynamics. This decade and the beginning of the next decade, we shall see a reversal of this trend. A reversal of this trend when Asia shall rise again and Asia shall become the dominant economic power. But this change is basically driven by three great forces: the forces of globalization, the force of demographic change, and technology at its best. Globalization is today irreversible, driven after the Second World War by the formation of the United Nations and the realization that war is no longer necessary or possible in a world where the whole world could be destroyed by technology. It led to the formation of the European Union. It led to the formation of trade blocs all around the world and the realization that trade is a necessity ingredient to drive the world forward. But the biggest change that came about in this was the rise of the student revolution in France in the late 50s and early 60s and the Vietnam War. For the first time, young people rose up around the world and said they will no longer fight war. And the idea was war was something which they opposed. And that led to the hippie movement and the liberal movement all around the world, which led ultimately to the idea that war has to be banned in a sort of a way, and then the world has to be run in a very, very different manner. But the post-Second World War architecture was essentially built upon the pre-World War architecture. Even though the World War saw the defeat of Germany and Japan, it also saw the continuation of the then existing political and economic order. Globalization has become irresistible because trade and financial markets drive the world today. The financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated how a crisis starting in America could impact the whole world and bring the whole world to a knees today. Today in Asia, we have around $5 to $6 trillion of foreign reserves, or reserves built up in the economies of China, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. And these reserves are essentially the currencies of the United States or the currencies of Europe. So the savings of Asia are financing the consumption in Europe. Globalization also meant the flow of capital all around the world. Capital flows to the press of a button. More than $4.5 trillion of foreign exchange is traded every day all across the world. And financial markets lead to flows of money, leading to asset bubbles, and these financial markets could change the global dynamics itself. The markets are getting integrated at the trade level. China is the factory of the world. China has overtaken Germany to be the largest exporter and possibly the largest importer in the world. And the integration of China with Europe and America implies that the West is dependent upon China to maintain inflation at very low levels and to ensure that consumption carries on. You'll be surprised to note that in the last decade, the income of the middle class United States has not risen at all, and inflation has been contained because the factories of China made sure that goods could be supplied at very low rates. And there has been an enhancement in the quality of lives of the middle class in Europe and in the United States, driven by the rise of China. If China were to shutter markets, or China were to lose our markets, you could imagine how the world would be. At the same time, we are seeing the flow of intellectual power from all around the world. Because of certain dynamics, the world is competing for the best talent. And world is inviting people who are the best and the brightest to come forth and to work in their own countries. And this is exemplified by the example of a company called Apple in the United States. Apple earns about $50 billion in net income every year. Apple charges you for the iPhone something like about $500, out of which $108 is spent in China for manufacture, and the rest is the money that you pay for the design, the technology, and the intellectual input that Apple provides to the iPhone. And it implies that Apple is seeking the best talent the world has to offer. So you see the flow of talent from all over Asia to the United States and possibly to parts of Europe. The world is becoming a place which is competing for the best intellectual talent itself. So this globalization is now irreversible, and no country can resist the force of globalization. There's a demographic change taking place in the world, and this is having its own dynamics, driven by the aging of societies in Europe. In Europe, I'm told that there are 3 young Germans to pay the pension of a senior citizen in Germany. In 2020, there'll be only 2 Germans to pay the pension of a senior retiree. Scandinavia has seen the decline in population. 15% of France is North African or Muslim. And at the same time, in Germany is facing a shortage of young people to work in its booming economy. UK has about 15% Asian population. London has 25% Asian. And by 2050, 25% United Kingdom is expected to be Asian, largely from Pakistan and Bangladesh. So you are seeing a large inflow of people from all over to meet the demands of economies which are aging. The median age of Europe today is something like 41 years. The United States is seeing a demographic change. By 2050, the United States is expected to be majority Hispanic. Just imagine if the Hispanics dominate the political economy of the United States. What will be the impact on the world politics? You'll see the rise of a Hispanic bloc, possibly. You'll see the rise of a Chinese bloc. And you'll see the rise of possibly an Indian bloc with a diaspora all around the world coming together. Demographic change also implies that economies tend to shrink. Japan is a classic case today. The Japanese population of 127 million is expected to shrink to 97 million by 2050 and 67 million by 2100, according to some studies. And the reason is the Japanese population is getting older, there are not enough babies being born. And just last year, more diapers were sold to senior citizens of Japan than to young children. And you can imagine the change when the larger part of the population consists of senior citizens and young children no longer are coming forth in enough numbers. And if we shut the door to immigration, the only solution would be a shrinking country. So this demographic change all over is remaking the world. And in this, Asia is at a very distinct advantage. China is seeing a change in its population policy. The Chinese government just announced that the families which have at least one member who comes from one-child family can have 2 children. It's in 1978, China started the one-child policy, and it said today that China could grow older before it becomes richer. India has a young population, 650 million below the age of 30. Until 2050, India could be the supplier of high-quality talent for the whole world. Africa is going very well in terms of its demography. The African continent is pretty young. The Middle East is very young. About 80% of the population of the Middle East is reportedly under the age of 18. And when these young people grow up with high aspiration, linked to the internet, and with a high consumer affection, then you can imagine how the world will be. So this kind of a demographic change, where the developed world or the OECD markets are shrinking in population, aging very rapidly, the Asian continent is seeing an explosion of young people, Africa is seeing an explosion of young people, will have its impact on what the world is going to be. Technology is reshaping the world. Technology has made human life that much more enjoyable, and that goes further than ever before. The life expectancy of human beings on the planet today is about 72 years. In 1900, the life expectancy of an Indian was 27 years. In 1947, it was 31 years. Today is about 67 years. People are living longer. Women live up to an age of 88 in Japan. Men live up to 85. And the time is not far when people living up to 100 will be quite easy. Technology has reduced the pain inherent in a human life through drugs which can treat most diseases. Technology has led to stem cell research which could regenerate organs in a human body. To the many, many billionaires around the world, they could look forward to a greater life, a much more enjoyable life with the advent of stem cell research. And we're also seeing the rise of the internet, a phenomenon like no other. Throughout human history, knowledge was the preserve of a small number of people because knowledge was the source of power. So throughout history, knowledge belongs to a few and the great many were in ignorance. The creation or the invention of the printing press in the 15th century led to an explosion of books and printing, but even then knowledge was kept a small number. We have seen how the libraries of Nalanda and Takshila were burned. The libraries of Alexandria were burned by invaders who sought to capture various countries. Because when you want to invade a country, the first thing you do is to destroy the intelligentsia. You keep the idea of that culture alive. Destroy the libraries which encapsulate all the ideas and the knowledge of that particular civilization. But today, with the explosion of the internet, with the internet becoming the single source of information, knowledge for the entire humanity, with all of the accumulated knowledge of humankind being available on the internet to anybody free of cost who's connected to the web, we are seeing a tremendous amount of change. Is leveling the knowledge field across the world. A child in Timbuktu in Africa, a child in Kalahandi, a child in New York, a child in London, a child in Manipal, all could have access to the same knowledge base. And this access to the same knowledge base, driven by wireless, driven by technology, driven by lower prices, means that everybody stands an equal chance. And this also means that tyrannical governments which seek to suppress this people will soon find information going forth from their own country. They will not be able to shut the country down. They will not be able to ensure that whatever they do will be within their national boundaries. So the whole idea of national boundaries has to be thought about anew. The biggest country in the world is going to be Facebook, an electronic country which is linked with possibly 1 billion people today. And the change on the base may not seem very high, ladies and gentlemen, but the change at the margin is incredible. If you talk to a 14-year-old in any part of the world, you talk to a 15-year-old in the part of the world, you see a very new creature talking to you. It is not something that we have seen over the last 100 years. The difference between the thinking of a 14-year-old and a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old is the difference between chalk and cheese. And the difference is wide because this generation is steeped in technology, works in technology, has access to an enormous pool of human knowledge and thinks very differently and has no idea of the past, has no idea of history, is more concerned about the self, is more concerned about the immediate, and is more concerned about almost instant gratification. And these people are going to be the future of the world. But the world in the next 20 years, when this generation tends to dominate, is going to be very different, and technology is the heart of it. But behind all this is the fact that innovation cycles are becoming shorter and shorter. A human being cannot accept change beyond a certain extent. But change is becoming so very rapid that within a period of 10 years or 15 years, the quantum of change itself will be tremendous. And this quantum of change will create generational differences all across the world, and that alone will be the source of conflict. So we are going to see technology accelerate, we are going to see people living longer, and we are going to see instances of greater amount of knowledge available all around the world. Technology has also democratized societies all around the world because ideas can easily spread. The idea of Christianity took 1,500 years to transmit around the world. The idea of Buddhism took some 600, 700 years. But the idea of the internet has taken just 25, 30 years to dominate the world. In all this change, the one shining star is going to be Asia. Like M.D. Nalapal said, the 19th century was a European century led by the United Kingdom and the rise of imperialism. The 20th century was an American century after the First World War and especially after the Second World War. The 21st century will be an Asian century. And Asia once again will rise after 250, 300 years to be the dominant economic power in this century. Asia is nearly 60% of the world's population. The youngest population in the world, about 35-40% of world GDP, growing at 5 to 6%. You can imagine if 60% of the world's population started growing at 5 to 6%, what will be the impact on the world's resources? What will be the impact on commodities? What will be the impact on oil prices? What will be the consumption of iron ore? And you're seeing the impact in terms of its effect on the planet. Sustainability becomes a key issue. Climate change becomes a key issue. And sustainability and climate change impacts the entire world. And so there's going to be a conflict between the rising consumer power of Asia and the developed markets, which are already consuming much more than they do. It is said that America, with 5% of the world's population, consumes 25% of the world resources. Today we are consuming 1.5 times the world's resources, and the planet is unable to replenish these resources at the pace, and the planet is slowly changing in its contours. What this means for the future when growth accelerates in Asia is something that we need to see. But when Asia grows at 5 to 6% a year, the United States or North America grows at between 2 to 3%, Europe grows at 1 to 2%. If you project forward, by 2050, Asia could make up 50 to 55% of the world GDP. The greatest growth, the biggest growth in the next 25, 30 years is going to be in Asia. So the time has now come to consider a great idea, the idea of an Asian common market. An Asian common market without a political union, because it's almost impossible to even debate that, even to think about it, without a common currency, because that again is impossible. And whether a common currency is a panacea for economic ills is highly debatable, looking at what is happening in Europe right now. So, but we could look at an Asian common market as a trade bloc where there is reduced friction to trade, where the people of Asia come together to discuss and to debate the idea of a common market and try to reduce all the barriers to trade so that more intra-Asia trade can take place. There could be easier access to business, easier flow of great talent, and easier access to capital. Let's remember that Asia has between $5 to $6 billion of reserves. The savings of Asia are far, far greater than the savings of people in Europe or in America or in Africa. And these savings, coupled with the manufacturing progress of Asia, coupled with the talent of Asia, can drive the power of Asia forward. Yes, there will be political conflicts in Asia. There are many unresolved issues, and these unresolved issues could take another 100 years to resolve. But we need not spend time on them, because underneath these unresolved issues, trade dominates. India-China trades about $70 billion. I think Southeast Asia and China trades about $200 billion. I think Japan and China trades between $400 to $500 billion. And if you look at the trade of the Middle East with the rest of Asia, and if you look at the trade between the Southeast Asian blocs and China of the rest of the world, you'll find a trend that the whole of Asia is coming together and the trade progress is going up. Asia has energy for the entire world. Asia has technology for the entire world. Asia has the market to be a world in itself. Asia has the financial capital to be a world for itself. But what Asia lacks is the idea of a common market, is the meeting place. And therefore one does see the existing world powers looking at breaking up Asia into blocks, encouraging the formation of the ASEAN and the enhancement of the ASEAN, encouraging the APEC to come forward, the idea of SAFTA, the idea of a Gulf Cooperation Council, the idea of Central Asia being a bloc, the idea of Russia aligning itself with Germany. But the West is not talking about the concept of an Asian common market. So it's important for the people of Asia to come together and to talk about it. So what is needed today is an idea so strong, so compelling, that the idea brings people together. And a more economically strong Asia will bring peace and prosperity to this world. But it will also impact the global institutions. The United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank needs to change, because the economic power will be dominantly with Asia. The global architecture which runs the world today is based upon the post-Second World War ideas, and that idea has to now change. And so the 21st century will be an Asian century, driven by trade, driven by the movement of people, driven by capital, driven by culture and everything else, driven by tourism, and above all, the 21st century will be driven by an idea, the idea of Asia uninterrupted. Thank you very much.